And I don't want to be a person who will start to lose interest before I even know a person as a result of my own preconceived judgments of their place on the social hierarchy. God damn, that's ridiculous. I don't want to be that kind of person. And I notice that. I notice that every now and then, right? That's kind of fucked. So this is also interesting because I started realizing that a lot of this might actually also be in part due to projection, right? Because if I am exhibiting those behaviors, I might be projecting that onto the people around me as well. There we go. So this is in continuation, sort of a video that I made before, the last one I made, which was about essentially feelings of inferiority and self-image and kind of how to, I don't know, how to address that in a sense. And so I did some more thinking on it, and I realized that I could use kind of like just a standard problem solving approach in order to actually begin to dissect the problem, since it feels so kind of amorphous. And so that's what this one's going to be about. So, all right, so I wrote in here, yesterday's journal was a lot, but I think it was necessary. Now that I've recognized this as a problem, however, I don't want to let it continue, right? So it's kind of difficult because I don't exactly know how to fix it, but I'm going to try anyway, and I'll take a very standard problem-solving approach. First, I need to understand the problem. And to do that, I need to figure out what it is that I know about the problem, right? So at a base level, I think that the main issue is my feelings of inferiority, right? But is that really everything? So I discovered through conversation with a friend yesterday that it's difficult for me to connect with other guys, I guess, because I automatically draw a sort of barrier. And so I think that's kind of a result of those feelings of inferiority that I mentioned. But also, the thing is, and I write about it here because I'm journaling for myself, so I don't really provide any context on what I'm talking about. But essentially, throughout my life, especially very early on, I was always, and like, feels weird kind of just like saying this, but I was always, am I still recording yet? I was always, I guess, I was the kid who was bullied a lot, right? And it's like, yeah, whatever. But I have a lot of memories from being like, from very early childhood up through until like middle school or so. Things were better in high school mostly. But I have a lot of memories of being bullied. And the weird thing though is that the weird thing is though that I don't have a lot of memories of being bullied. And I know those are kind of contradictory statements, but what I mean is that I have many memories that were of me being bullied, but I have even more memories that I actually can't remember of me being bullied. And the only way that I know of those things is through either like friends or parents, like my mom, for example, who has told me a lot of things that happened to me when I was a kid that are just like completely blocked out of my memory. Like very specific events that are just like gone, no reference in my head, right? And so I think that this kind of bullying from a very early age is something that has heavily influenced me in many ways that I never quite realized or like consciously acknowledged. And so that is, yeah, so that's what I'm talking about throughout all this. And so I discovered through a conversation with a friend that because of all those experiences, I immediately start to kind of build walls around myself when I'm in groups of guys, for example, because the thing is, this isn't something, I was never really bullied by girls as a kid, right? Like it was mostly just like other guys who I was around. And so I just kind of subconsciously put up a barrier towards like just friends, even friends who are guys, right? And I was never able to get as close with them as I would with like my female friends. And I always had more friends who were girls growing up. With a few exceptions of like some very close friends I have now, but just in general, yeah. Just took a second because there was some noise around. Anyway, yeah, so I'm going kind of all over the place here because I'm still formulating these thoughts, but the point is that one of the issues here is this kind of residual fear of bullying on my part, right? where I still kind of put up walls as a result of not wanting to feel vulnerable in those situations, right? And I put up walls with certain people, and I think that is a separate thing from my inferiority, or from my feelings of inferiority, right? And so that's something else. Along with that, I wrote a little bit about just feeling like kind of fears of abandonment throughout my life, and I'm not sure whether or not those result from feelings of inferiority, but I don't think that they're super relevant, right? But I'll keep it in mind. So what else is there? I think one thing is my view of the hierarchy, regardless of whether or not it is true, right? So in a way, and I don't know if this is something I mentioned in the last video, but I just kind of habitually, it's almost hardwired for me to start putting people into places in a form of hierarchy in my head, which is not usually, yeah, no, I definitely talked about this in the last one, but it's just not generally either realistic or relevant, and it's often very biased, and it's not accurate, and so there's a whole bunch of problems with that. But so in a way, I think the only people who, like, let's assume that this hierarchy was really the case, right? I think the only people who would ever even think about it are the only people who can recognize the hierarchy are those who are at the bottom, those who have to deal with it and contend with it. Those who are closer to the top never even have to think about it, right? It's not part of their existence, because it's just not something that they have to think about, because it doesn't limit them, right? Assuming that this hierarchy exists. And if they were to acknowledge it, they would kind of come off as assholes, right? So the idea of the hierarchy in my head, I think, just needs to go, because there isn't anything preventing me from connecting to anyone, right? There's no use in thinking about this hierarchy, because whether or not it exists, the only thing it will do is limit, right? Is limit me. And so that's one of the reasons why I think that's another separate thing that has to go. And also the thing is, my preconceptions are often just wrong most of the time. It's like very biased and very inaccurate, very incorrect. And so there's just no reason to continue viewing things in that way, right? If I'm really examining my feelings and beliefs and how I can change them. And so those are the kind of the three main things that I realized. From there, so I think I'm satisfied with that. And now I think I should move on to like actual symptoms and effects and instances that result from these problems, so that I can understand them a little further. And so that's what I started writing about. So a big one, I think, and we'll go section by section. A big one here is hyper-awareness. I just realized this is going to be a long video. So a big one here is hyper-awareness and misinterpretations of the actions of the people around me, right? So I find myself getting in my head and taking everything personally. The absence of attention, two people having a conversation and not explicitly including me. Certain things that people say, jokes, all kinds of things, right? I interpret all of these things negatively, but even before that, I will interpret them as being about me in the first place, when oftentimes I'm completely irrelevant, right? So it doesn't have anything to do with me. And in some situations, like, I just don't, like, it's just not something that even exists, right? It's a non-factor. And so this is a big one, I think, in multiple ways, because it leads me to start feeling anxious and paranoid in group settings, right? And I'll start drawing lines between myself and others as a result of that, because I'll start getting this feeling of inferiority again, right? And I'll start reminding myself of that, and suddenly my brain will start looking for evidence to contribute to that fact. And from there, I will start feeling as though I am being judged and I am being looked down on and I am being separated. But by feeling that way, right, by allowing myself to view things in that way, I'm the one who's starting to separate myself from the people around me. And that's something that I notice myself falling into occasionally, right? Not all the time, but occasionally. So yeah, I will start feeling anxious and paranoid in groups and drawing lines between myself and others. And sometimes I will even start to villainize people around me, especially other guys, if I feel like it almost feels like actions will take on a threatening meaning to me, in a sense, right? And I don't even realize that I'm starting to do this, or I don't even realize when I will like in the moments that I do this. Like I mentioned before, I just start taking things negatively, right? I start interpreting things in the wrong way, in a way that feels hostile towards me, when that's normally not, like, that's usually just not the case at all, right? So let me make sure, just real quick, that I'm still recording. Yeah, all's good. So So this is a really big one, right? This influences a lot. But where does it come from? I think that it comes down to a mix between my mind actively trying to find evidence to prove to myself that I'm inferior, right? Because of my own pre-existing self-image, which my brain tries to rationalize all the experiences I have into, and an old residual fear of bullying that compounds this feeling, especially when it comes to other guys, right? So that's what happened with, and then I start writing here. That's what happened with this other person who I had this experience with recently, where not super recently, but I immediately pegged him as this guy who was kind of above me in this social hierarchy, and as a result, I also thought he was therefore the kind of person who was likely to bully me. And all of this happened subconsciously. I didn't even realize it. And so from there, this then prompted my brain to start searching for evidence in support of that theory. And then I began misinterpreting all of these tiny, tiny actions, right, as threats to myself. This is, and so this ended up like, I just started feeling divided from this person. And I started feeling like, not like they were out to get me or anything like that, but just like this person didn't like me and was trying to make fun of me, or was trying to like look down on me or something like that. But none of that was true is the thing, right? Like I was able to take a step back and look at this and realize that all of those feelings, like none of that was true. None of those events that played out in my head were actually real, right? And I actually had a great conversation with this person. And we chilled, right? Like it was just like, it's chill. That's it. It's not hostile, right? And I have to convince myself of that. But again, it's kind of like I mentioned last time, it's new software operating on old hardware. And so now I'm examining the hardware, right? This also happened with this girl a long time ago, right? Where I pegged her as, and I'm differentiating here because my fear of bullying is something that specifically happens with other men. But there was this woman, and so like I pegged her as much higher in the social hierarchy in a sense. And so I drew a line between myself and her, assuming that she wasn't interested, like that she was just uninterested in becoming friends with me, right? I wasn't trying to chase anything else, just, trying to make friends and stuff. I assumed that she was uninterested in being friends with me. And so then from that moment, my mind went to work again, finding evidence to contribute to wherever it could for that very idea, to contribute to the idea that she was uninterested in being friends with me, when that's just not the case, right? Like that I was starting to write, as I mentioned before, write narratives that would weave through my experiences in places that narrative just didn't exist. It was a fabrication. And so, yeah, I think this is also one of the reasons why this whole idea of a hierarchy in my head needs to go, because I keep doing all this after making judgments of someone's place in this hierarchy, right? But this hierarchy doesn't even exist. And there's no use in it, because all it does is start having negative consequences, right? It just limits me more than anything else. And so this also goes in the opposite direction, where I actually started to notice that if I will peg someone as lower than me in this kind of social hierarchy, in a sense, I'll just find myself like subconsciously having less interest in connecting with them. And that's kind of fucked up, right? Like I don't want to be that kind of person, especially because I think a lot of people have there's just so many reasons to connect with so many different people. And I don't want to be a person who will start to lose interest before I even know a person as a result of my own preconceived judgments of their place on the social hierarchy. God damn, that's ridiculous. I don't want to be that kind of person. And I notice that every now and then, right? That's kind of fucked. So this is also interesting because I started realizing that a lot of this might actually also be in part due to projection, right? Because if I am exhibiting those behaviors, I might be projecting that onto the people around me as well. And this could be like a chicken or the egg problem. I don't know where it started, but I think that's a very interesting thought, because it's also a key towards helping to solve this problem. Because if part of it is projection, then I need to start by changing that behavior myself as well, right? And again, this goes back to kind of like dismantling that idea of the hierarchy within my head. So yeah, that was something very interesting that I thought about while I started writing this, and that was kind of mind-blowing. Let me make sure I'm still recording. Cool. Yeah, so there's also just this general difficulty, and I mentioned this before, but connecting with other guys, right? So like I mentioned, throughout my life, I've had mostly friends who were girls. Mostly just, I guess as a kid, they were nicer to me. it was harder generally to be friends with guys and to connect with them. Although I always had a couple guy friends. Um, Usually those friendships would not end, but would usually be blocked from moving further as a result of my own feelings of vulnerability and threat, I guess, because I would often start to, again, misinterpret things. And so there's some good friendships that I messed up as a result of that. But I've been able to keep in touch with some of those, and I feel like I don't know if I've ever addressed it, but I'm going back to them. But yeah, so I think that I just assume kind of subconsciously that guys will see me as other in a sense and bully me, which I don't consciously think this, right? That's ridiculous. But I think that it feels like I'll be forever closed off to being friends with them, right? And all of this is like, I realize now this is a big thing for me, and I didn't even realize that it was influencing so many of my interactions with other people. But I think that on some subconscious level, I still view myself as like that awkward little kid who never understood everything and couldn't connect with people and always got bullied and left out, right? And this is weird because these are not things that I think about on a regular basis anymore. As a kid, all the time. But this isn't really a problem for me these days, right? At least it's not consciously a problem. I didn't realize that on some level I still had all this, like, I guess maybe trauma unaddressed, right? All these childhood experiences. And so that's still impacting my own self-image, where on some level, somewhere inside, I still view myself as that same, like, awkward little kid, right? The one who always got bullied. And so I think that's something that I have to address as well, because if I can't move on from that self-image, then this is going to continue influencing me, because I'm subconsciously using that self-image as a way to then start feeling vulnerable around other people, right? Or not using it, but that self-image will cause me to start feeling vulnerable around other people, right? And so it's hard to write because I just don't think those feelings have gone away. And I thought that they did. I haven't thought about this in a long time, right? These childhood experiences, but they still have a bit of a grip on me. And so the crazy thing is that I'm the only one who sees myself in this way, right? So if my self-image is that of like this awkward little kid who doesn't understand anything, has difficulty connecting with people, who people like to make fun of and bully, and who always gets left out and all that, right? And that's how I view myself on like some subconscious level. Nobody else sees that, right? Like nobody else knows my past, right? Nobody who I know knows that I was like, unless other than people who I've talked to about it, nobody's aware of like my childhood, for example, who I used to be, how what I used to be was different from what I am now, right? Nobody knows that. They just see me as I am now. But the issue is that if I have this kind of deep-seated self-image, right, then it doesn't matter like what I do, because eventually other people will pick up on that, because deep inside that is how I view myself, right? And if other people start to pick up on that, right, I mean, people these days are much nicer than like the people I know now all over are much nicer than the people who were bullying me as a kid. Also, kids are just kind of awful sometimes, right? So all that just kind of usually gets taken out as you start to grow up. But there's this kind of idea where if I continue to believe this in myself, it will become a self-fulfilling prophecy, whether it's through other people or through the workings of my own mind, right? It will become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so I got to work on that self-image as well, because that's not what I want. That's not the life I want for myself. So let me make sure I'm still recording and all. Nice. Okay, so another thing, and like I mentioned before, this is going to be kind of a long video. Another thing which I actually think might tie more into my situation, I guess maybe a little bit more of a family situation, I don't want to talk too much, is something about how I interact in a professional setting. I won't go too deep into this because I don't think it's particularly relevant. But there's like genuinely a hierarchy in professional settings. And so that combination with my general difficulty dealing with like other people in certain contexts just makes it kind of uncomfortable. And so this is like, I realize this is more of a behavioral issue than anything else, which is why this would probably just primarily benefit from exposure and practice alongside with dealing with the other issues that I mentioned, right? So it has more to do with just a little bit of discomfort than anything. But yeah, I don't think that's too relevant. Instead, a similar thing that is also kind of based in everything that came before, plus my situation that I mentioned with a certain family and stuff, is my general discomfort and hyper awareness in spaces that are not mine. And so, like, what does that mean, right? When I'm in my home, when I'm in a place that's like my room, right, my own car, those kinds of things, I'm comfortable. If I'm not in one of those, I will start to feel uncomfortable. And that sounds kind of ridiculous, and not specific, but specifically I mean that. So I started going on like a tangent that I decided was kind of unhelpful, um, and pointlessly complicated. So I just cut that out. What I'm talking about here is essentially a feeling of not being comfortable taking up space, and a hyper awareness as to how the things I do bother other people. And on some level, that's a good thing, right? On some level, like, you don't want to be the person who's yelling at 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. without thinking about, roommates or neighbors who are asleep, right? Like, you don't want to be the person who talks in an office when everyone's expecting quiet. You don't want to be, you don't want to be on the like end of the like the extreme end of the spectrum, going into someone's house and like opening their refrigerator and taking food, right? It's just like, there are some things that you want to be aware of, such that you don't inconvenience the people around you and you don't bother the people around you. And there are some things that are reasonable. I take that and I take it all the way to an unreasonable level, right? Where I do not feel comfortable doing very just like simple, unobtrusive things that are just like fine, they're normal, right? But they stress me out, right? I get stressed out with the idea of taking space and bothering the people around me, right? And I take this to what I think is an unreasonable level. So why, right? It's because I'm not comfortable, and that's obvious, right? But the thing is, I'm always worried that I'll bother or disturb other people, and so I'm never comfortable. But why am I always worried? It's because I feel vulnerable, I think. As a result of my feelings of inferiority, I feel like I can't take up space and I can't bother others because I am beneath them. I'm uncomfortable. I'm vulnerable as a result of my inferiority, and so I'm always worried, always uncomfortable. And even in my own home, this is often the case, where I just do not feel... I mean, there's a reason why I film all of my videos in random locations in my car, right? Because I feel uncomfortable with the idea of taking up space and of kind of, yeah. And it's like, even with like, and I love my friends and all, right? But I still have that feeling, right? And I don't know how to navigate that, but I just don't want to take up space. I have a strong hesitance towards taking up space. And that's not in a physical sense, but taking up space in literally any sense, right? Like just doing things that will affect that will affect another person, or that will bother another person, or any kind of thing like that, right? So yeah, that's just another thing that I was thinking about. Let me make sure I'm still recording. Yeah. All right. So this also goes into so another thing that this all goes into is me being way too much of an agreeable person as a result of my fear of confrontation and general conflict avoidance. So I don't know how much this has to do with like inferiority, although I'm sure it plays a role, but I know a massive source is how I was raised. And I won't get into much detail on that, but I think this has caused me, this has just caused me so many problems in my life, this kind of extreme agreeableness in a sense, and conflict avoidance, because so many problems. So this is something that I should actually journal about on its own sometime, and maybe make a separate video for as well. But it's just, it's a big thing. And what you don't realize is, when you're too agreeable, when you allow yourself to get walked over and you make that a habit and you avoid conflict like the plague, when that is the case, it will start to seep into every aspect of your life, and you will have difficulty forming boundaries in all places where those boundaries need to be formed, and you will cause yourself to persist in negative situations for much longer than you should, because you don't have the ability to, I guess, stand up for yourself, right? And this leads into so many things, and you will, and on another level as well, you will also find yourself possibly even becoming implicit in things that you dislike, because you don't have the ability, you don't have either the confidence or just the general ability to stand up and say something and go into that conflict when something happens that you don't like, right? And so there are a lot of issues. I think generally people think of being agreeable as a good thing, and I do think that's the case to a certain extent, but there is definitely a point where once you cross the line into becoming too agreeable, it is negative for you and the people around you. And so this is a big thing. I'll talk about this in another video, because I have feelings on it as well. But that's, yeah. So this has had small effects, like causing me to slowly build up frustration for some things that people do when I'm too scared to mention it to them, and they do it repeatedly, and each time it just frustrates me more and more and builds up inside, right? Or like on another level, I was in a situation, I was in a bad situation, and I stayed in that situation for much longer than I should have, because I just didn't have the ability to resolve conflicts when they happen, and I didn't have the ability to honestly just like get up and leave, right? And that's so important. Again, I'll get into all that later. So the point is, this is really something that I need to work on, but I also think it's only marginally related to inferiority. Although inferiority does play a role, I think it's mostly its own thing. So, cool. There we go. Those are most of the things that I think have been the effects of feelings of inferiority and my kind of childhood experiences with bullying and all of that. Those are most of the effects that I think have had on my life in terms of like just kind of the social consequences of it, right? So, great. What do I do about all this, right? And so this is the interesting part. I think that writing this all out has helped me, since I'm now able to understand a problem that was previously very abstract and amorphous and that I didn't even know how to begin dissecting, right? Now I understand the effects a little bit more concretely. I'm starting to get an idea for like a more, I guess, almost like corporeal form of the problem, right? And so now it would probably be helpful to condense my understanding of the problem and what I've written into something that is less complex and easier to visualize, and so that I can start like actually working on a solution. And I wrote some stuff here, and I'll probably take a picture of that and show it on screen. Let me make sure I'm still recording. Yeah, cool. So it's actually, I realize now that it's starting to get a bit dark, and so I might cut this video short, and maybe I'll just, actually, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. So I'll keep this one down to just talking about those experiences and the effects that, and like getting a concrete idea of the effects that feelings of inferiority and all those different sources that I mentioned have. So, keeping this to just the sources, the effects, getting a concrete idea of the problem. And in the next video, I will talk about some of the ideas that I have had in order to actually start counteracting that, right? To start rewriting that self-image, rewrite the narratives, change, like actually address those feelings and change how I view experiences and how I interpret the actions of others, so that I can start doing things more positively, so that I can stop viewing things so negatively, right? And so that I can start little by little changing that self-image, so that I can actually grow from a place of not insecurity. Yeah, so I think that's something that, I'll go into on the next video. I'm still figuring it out. I have not finished journaling this, but yeah, I'll pick up here next time. And I hope that this has been helpful for you. I know that there wasn't a lot in terms of like steps and stuff to do here, but I think it's just a lot of interesting things to think about. It is very strange for me to be talking about all this, and with the knowledge that this will be going on the internet where people can see it. But my hope is that if anyone is able to relate with the things that I went more in depth to on this video, that they will be able to maybe find a little bit of inspiration in order to start examining their own experiences and their own thoughts for themselves, and hopefully be able to make some process in terms of, helping themselves to rewrite their self-identity and rewrite the narrative of their experiences, so that they can actually start to make progress in their life. So hopefully this has helped you, because that's my goal here. I feel hesitant towards putting all this out, but if it can help someone, that will be worth it. Yeah, I'm still figuring this all out myself. I don't have all the answers, but this is, I figured it would be good to document my journey as I try to actually make progress for once. So yeah, next one I'll talk about those some solutions, some ideas that I have, and we'll go from there. Cool.